Sarah Mitchell never imagined that a Tuesday morning jog through Riverside Park would change her life forever. The 28-year-old elementary school teacher had just completed her usual 3-mile route when she noticed the police cars blocking the park entrance. Officer Johnson approached her with a stern expression, asking if she had seen anything unusual during her run. "There was a robbery at the convenience store on Oak Street around 6:30 this morning," he explained. "The suspect fled on foot toward this area." Sarah shook her head, genuinely puzzled. She had been running with her headphones on, lost in her morning meditation playlist, completely unaware of any disturbance. What happened next would haunt Sarah for months to come. The store clerk, Mrs. Henderson, arrived at the scene and immediately pointed at Sarah. "That's her! That's the woman who robbed my store!" she declared with unwavering certainty. Sarah's heart dropped as she felt the world spinning around her. She tried to explain that she had been jogging the entire time, but her protests fell on deaf ears. The evidence seemed to stack against her in the most unfortunate way. The security camera footage was grainy, showing a woman of similar height and build wearing dark athletic clothes. Sarah happened to be wearing her black running outfit that morning. The timing aligned perfectly with when she would have been in the area. Most damning of all, Mrs. Henderson insisted she could never forget that face. Within hours, Sarah found herself in a holding cell trying to process the nightmare that had become her reality. She called her younger sister Emma, who worked as a paralegal downtown. Emma's voice cracked with disbelief when Sarah explained the situation. "This is insane, Sarah. Everyone knows you wouldn't hurt a fly," Emma said, promising to find the best lawyer their family could afford. The arrest made local headlines within days. "Local teacher accused of armed robbery" blazed across the front page of the Riverside Tribune. Sarah's principal, Mr. Davidson, was forced to place her on administrative leave pending the investigation. Parents began pulling their children from her classroom, despite her colleagues' protests about her character. The community Sarah had served for 5 years suddenly turned cold. Neighbors who once waved cheerfully now crossed the street to avoid her. The grocery store where she had shopped since college became a gauntlet of whispers and stares. Sarah found herself becoming a prisoner in her own home, afraid to face the judgment that awaited her outside. Her lawyer, Patricia Williams, was honest about the challenges they faced. "Eyewitness testimony is incredibly powerful in court," she explained during their first meeting. "Even when it's wrong, juries tend to believe it. We need to find concrete evidence that proves you weren't there. Or better yet, evidence that points to the real perpetrator." Sarah racked her brain for anything that could prove her innocence. She had been running alone that morning, as usual. Her fitness app had tracked her route, but a clever prosecutor could argue that data could be manipulated. She needed something more substantial, something undeniable. The stress began taking its toll on Sarah's health. She lost weight, developed insomnia, and found herself jumping at every unexpected sound. Her savings were rapidly depleting as legal fees mounted. Emma moved in temporarily to provide emotional support, but even her sister's presence couldn't ease the constant anxiety that gnawed at Sarah's stomach. 3 weeks after her arrest, Sarah discovered that Mrs. Henderson had a history of misidentification. Patricia's investigation revealed 2 previous incidents where the elderly woman had incorrectly identified suspects in minor crimes. However, the prosecution argued that this case was different because Mrs. Henderson had more time to observe the perpetrator. As the preliminary hearing approached, Sarah felt the weight of the entire legal system pressing down on her shoulders. She knew that somewhere out there the real criminal was walking free, while she faced the possibility of years in prison. The injustice of it all made her feel sick, but she was determined to fight with every resource available to her. The morning of the hearing, Sarah dressed in her most conservative outfit, hoping to project an image of respectability and innocence. As she walked into the courthouse with Patricia beside her, she caught sight of Mrs. Henderson in the hallway. The older woman's eyes filled with the same certainty that had started this nightmare, and Sarah realized just how uphill her battle would be. During the hearing, the prosecutor painted a picture of a desperate young woman facing financial pressures who had made a terrible decision. They presented the security footage, Mrs. Henderson's identification, and the circumstantial evidence of Sarah's presence in the area. Patricia countered with character witnesses and Sarah's spotless record, but the judge seemed unmoved. "Based on the evidence presented," Judge Morrison declared, "I find probable cause to bind this case over for trial." Sarah felt her knees weaken as the reality sank in. She was going to trial for a crime she didn't commit, and the evidence against her was strong enough to convince a seasoned judge. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment staring at the legal documents scattered across her coffee table. The trial was set for 2 months away, giving Patricia time to build a stronger defense. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, and somewhere in the shadows, the truth was slipping further away from her grasp. The irony wasn't lost on her that as a teacher she had always emphasized to her students the importance of truth and justice. Now she was learning firsthand how easily those principles could be twisted by circumstance and coincidence. She wondered if she would ever again have the same faith in the system she had once trusted implicitly. As Sarah prepared for the fight of her life, she had no way of knowing that miles away, a man named Jake Morrison was preparing for his annual hunting trip in the mountains surrounding Riverside. Jake, a retired detective turned wilderness guide, had no idea that his planned vacation would soon intersect with Sarah's desperate search for justice in the most unexpected way possible. Jake Morrison had been tracking deer through the dense woodland north of Riverside for 3 days when he stumbled upon something that would change everything. The 54-year-old retired detective had come to these mountains seeking solitude and the simple clarity that hunting provided after 30 years of dealing with criminals and victims. What he found instead was a mystery that pulled him back into the world he thought he had left behind. It was his hunting dog, Scout, who made the discovery. The German Shepherd had been sniffing around an old campsite when he began barking insistently at a pile of rocks near a dried creek bed. Jake initially assumed Scout had found animal remains, but as he approached, something caught his eye that made his detective instincts flare to life. Partially buried under the rocks was a small backpack, weathered but still intact. Jake carefully extracted it, his years of evidence handling automatically kicking in despite being in retirement. Inside the bag, he found items that immediately raised red flags. A dark wig that matched the hair length seen in the convenience store security footage, makeup supplies, and most shocking of all, a newspaper clipping about Sarah Mitchell's arrest. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the clipping. He had been following the case casually, like most residents of the area. But seeing the evidence before him made his stomach turn. Someone had been deliberately impersonating Sarah, and they had been confident enough about their crime to keep a trophy of her downfall. The backpack contained more disturbing evidence. There were printed screenshots of Sarah's social media profiles, showing her daily jogging routine and preferred routes through Riverside Park. Someone had been studying her habits, learning her patterns, and planning to use her identity as cover for their crime. The level of premeditation was chilling. Jake immediately called his former partner at the Riverside Police Department, Detective Maria Santos. "Maria, I need you to listen carefully," he said, his voice carrying the urgency of his discovery. "I'm up in the Cascades, and I've found evidence related to the Sarah Mitchell case. Someone set her up, and I can prove it." Detective Santos had always trusted Jake's instincts during their years working together. "What kind of evidence are we talking about, Jake?" she asked, already reaching for her car keys. Within an hour, she was driving up the mountain road to meet him at the campsite. When Maria arrived, Jake walked her through his discovery step by step. He showed her the positioning of the backpack, the contents, and his theory about how the real perpetrator had used this remote location as a base for planning and executing the frame job. "Look at these photos of Sarah," he said, spreading out the printed images. Someone was studying her like a predator studies prey. The evidence pointed to a level of sophistication that went far beyond a simple robbery. This was identity theft for criminal purposes, a federal offense that carried serious penalties. But more importantly for Sarah, it was proof of her innocence that could finally set her free. Maria carefully documented everything using her phone camera before they began the process of properly collecting the evidence. "We need to handle this exactly right," she told Jake. "Any mistakes in the chain of custody could render this inadmissible in court." They spent the rest of the afternoon carefully bagging and labeling each item, following procedures that could withstand the scrutiny of both prosecutors and defense attorneys. While they worked, Jake couldn't stop thinking about Sarah Mitchell. He had seen her photo in the newspaper, a young woman whose life had been turned upside down by someone else's calculated cruelty. "How long has she been facing this nightmare?" he asked Maria, who consulted her phone. "The trial starts in 3 weeks, Maria replied grimly. "She's been living under this cloud for almost 2 months now, lost her job, her reputation, probably most of her savings on legal fees." The weight of Sarah's suffering added urgency to their mission to uncover the truth. Back at the police station, the evidence began revealing more secrets. The wig, when examined closely, contained DNA that didn't match Sarah's. The makeup kit included foundation several shades darker than Sarah's natural complexion, suggesting the perpetrator had been trying to alter their appearance to better match their target. Most intriguing was a receipt found tucked into a pocket of the backpack. It was from a camping supply store in Millbrook, a town about 50 miles from Riverside. The purchase date was 1 week before the robbery, and it included items like the backpack itself, waterproof bags, and camping gear. The receipt was paid for with cash, but it included a timestamp that might help them identify the buyer through security cameras. Jake volunteered to drive to Millbrook with Maria to follow up on this lead. The camping store owner, Bill Thompson, remembered the transaction clearly when shown the receipt. "Yeah, I remember her," he said, studying the timestamp. "Young woman, maybe early 30s, paid cash for everything. Seemed nervous, kept checking her phone." The store's security system had been upgraded recently, and they still had footage from the date in question. Jake and Maria watched the grainy video with growing excitement as a woman entered the store, selected the items on their receipt, and paid at the counter. The image quality wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough to see that this woman looked nothing like Sarah Mitchell. The woman in the footage was shorter than Sarah, with different facial features and a completely different build. She had been wearing a baseball cap pulled low, but when she looked up at the cashier, her face was clearly visible. "This is our smoking gun," Maria said, immediately requesting a copy of the footage. Jake studied the woman's movements on the video. Something about her behavior triggered his detective instincts. "She's been in the system before," he told Maria. "Look at how she avoids looking directly at the security cameras, how she positions herself at the counter." This isn't amateur hour. They ran the woman's image through the facial recognition system back at the station. Within hours, they had a match. Rebecca Torres, a 31-year-old woman with a history of identity theft and fraud. She had been arrested twice in neighboring states for similar schemes, always targeting women whose lives she could study and temporarily adopt. Rebecca's criminal history revealed a pattern that made Sarah's case even more tragic. She specialized in finding victims who lived routine lives, studying their habits until she could impersonate them convincingly enough to commit crimes in their name. Sarah's predictable jogging schedule and social media presence had made her a perfect target. The investigation revealed that Rebecca had been watching Sarah for at least a month before the robbery. She had learned Sarah's route, her timing, and even her preferred running attire. On the morning of the crime, Rebecca had positioned herself to commit the robbery just as Sarah would be completing her jog, creating the perfect opportunity for misidentification. Jake and Maria worked through the night, building a comprehensive case that would not only exonerate Sarah, but ensure that Rebecca Torres faced justice for her elaborate scheme. They contacted Sarah's lawyer, Patricia Williams, who immediately filed an emergency motion to halt the trial proceedings. "This changes everything," Patricia told Sarah during a late-night phone call. "We have concrete evidence that proves not only your innocence, but identifies the actual perpetrator. The district attorney will have no choice but to drop all charges against you." For the first time in 2 months, Sarah allowed herself to feel hope. But even as relief flooded through her, she couldn't shake the anger at how easily her life had been derailed by someone's calculated deception. She thought about the students she hadn't been able to teach, the relationships that had been damaged, and the trust in justice that had been shaken to its core. The next morning, Jake accompanied Detective Santos to Rebecca Torres's last known address. They found her apartment abandoned, but neighbors reported seeing her leave hastily 2 days earlier with several suitcases. Rebecca had apparently realized that her luck was running out and had fled before the law could catch up with her. A statewide manhunt began for Rebecca Torres, but Jake knew from experience that someone with her skills might be difficult to track. She had probably already assumed a new identity and moved to a different state, looking for her next victim. But at least Sarah Mitchell would be free. And that was what mattered most to the retired detective who had stumbled upon the truth while simply trying to enjoy his time in the wilderness. The courtroom was packed on the morning when District Attorney Robert Chen stood before Judge Morrison to make an unprecedented announcement. Sarah Mitchell sat beside Patricia Williams, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, hardly daring to believe that her nightmare might finally be ending. Behind her, she could feel the weight of public attention as reporters, community members, and former students filled every available seat. "Your Honor," D.A. Chen began, his voice carrying the gravity of the moment, "in light of new evidence discovered by former Detective Jake Morrison, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Ms. Sarah Mitchell with prejudice." The phrase "with prejudice" meant the charges could never be refiled, a complete vindication that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Judge Morrison reviewed the evidence that Jake and Detective Santos had compiled over the past week. The backpack, the DNA evidence, the security footage from the camping store, and the identification of Rebecca Torres as the actual perpetrator painted an undeniable picture of Sarah's innocence. Miss Mitchell, the judge said, turning to address Sarah directly, on behalf of this court, I want to express our regret for what you have endured. The charges against you are hereby dismissed. The courtroom erupted in applause as Sarah finally allowed herself to break down. Patricia Williams embraced her client, while reporters frantically scribbled notes about this dramatic reversal. In the back of the courtroom, Jake Morrison sat quietly, satisfied that justice had finally been served, but knowing that the real work was just beginning. Mrs. Henderson, the store clerk whose misidentification had started this ordeal, approached Sarah outside the courthouse. The elderly woman's eyes were filled with tears as she struggled to find words. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. I was so sure it was you. I never meant to hurt an innocent person.
Sarah, despite everything she had endured, found herself feeling sympathy for the older woman who had been just as much a victim of Rebecca Torres' deception. The media attention that had once painted Sarah as a criminal now celebrated her as a victim of an elaborate fraud. News outlets across the region picked up the story of the hunter who had accidentally uncovered evidence that freed an innocent woman. Jake Morrison found himself thrust into an unwelcome spotlight, politely declining most interview requests while focusing on helping law enforcement track down Rebecca Torres. Sarah's journey back to normalcy proved more challenging than she had anticipated. Principal Davidson immediately offered to reinstate her, but Sarah discovered that some parents remained skeptical despite her exoneration. The damage to her reputation will take time to heal, Patricia Williams explained to reporters. Being proven innocent doesn't immediately undo 2 months of public suspicion and media coverage. The financial impact of her ordeal was severe. Legal fees had consumed most of Sarah's savings, and 2 months without income had forced her to borrow money from her sister Emma. The school district, recognizing their role in her suffering, offered a settlement for the wrongful administrative leave, but it barely covered her expenses and couldn't compensate for the emotional trauma she had endured. Jake Morrison became an unexpected ally in Sarah's recovery. The retired detective understood the psychological impact of being caught in the criminal justice system. Having seen it from the other side throughout his career, he visited Sarah at her apartment one evening, bringing with him a bottle of wine and a genuine desire to help her process what had happened. The hardest part isn't proving your innocence, Jake told Sarah as they sat on her balcony overlooking the park where her ordeal had begun. It's learning to trust the world again after it turned against you so quickly. His words resonated deeply with Sarah, who had been struggling with anxiety and insomnia even after her vindication. The manhunt for Rebecca Torres continued for several weeks before bearing fruit. A tip from a hotel clerk in Phoenix led to her arrest at a small motel where she had been using false identification. When detained, Rebecca was found to be carrying materials suggesting she was already studying a new potential victim, a local yoga instructor whose daily routine she had been documenting. Rebecca's arrest brought closure to Sarah's case but revealed the scope of her criminal enterprise. Investigators discovered that she had successfully framed at least 3 other women in different states over the past 5 years. 2 had accepted plea deals rather than face trial, while another had served 6 months in prison for a crime Rebecca had committed. Sarah's case, ironically, had become the one that finally exposed the pattern and brought Rebecca to justice. During Rebecca's trial, Sarah chose to attend and face the woman who had nearly destroyed her life. Rebecca Torres appeared in court looking nothing like the calculated predator Sarah had imagined. She was petite, with ordinary features that would blend into any crowd. Her ordinariness made her crime seem even more chilling, as she could be anyone's neighbor, anyone's co-worker, anyone's friend. The prosecution presented evidence showing Rebecca's elaborate methodology for selecting and studying her victims. She used social media, public records, and patient observation to build detailed profiles of women whose lives she could temporarily steal. Sarah learned that she had been chosen not randomly, but because her predictable schedule and trusting nature made her an ideal target for impersonation. When given the opportunity to make a victim impact statement, Sarah stood before the court with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Rebecca Torres didn't just rob a convenience store, she said, her voice steady and clear. She robbed me of my career, my reputation, my sense of security,
and my faith in justice. She robbed the other women she framed of years of their lives. She robbed the community of trust in the legal system. Sarah continued, addressing Rebecca directly. But what she couldn't rob was my determination to rebuild, my family's love, my friends' loyalty, and my belief that truth eventually prevails. I will not let her crimes define the rest of my life. The courtroom was silent as Sarah returned to her seat, having transformed from victim to survivor before everyone's eyes. Judge Morrison sentenced Rebecca Torres to 15 years in federal prison for identity theft, fraud, and multiple counts of filing false police reports. The sentence reflected not only Sarah's case but the other victims whose lives Rebecca had disrupted. Ms. Torres, the judge stated, your crimes represent a particularly cruel form of theft. You stole not just money, but innocence, trust, and peace of mind from your victims. Following Rebecca's sentencing, Sarah made a decision that surprised many who knew her. Instead of trying to forget her ordeal, she chose to transform it into a force for good. She began working with the Innocence Project, an organization dedicated to exonerating wrongfully convicted individuals, using her experience to help others navigate the emotional and practical challenges of being falsely accused. Jake Morrison also found new purpose in the aftermath of the case. He began consulting with law enforcement agencies on cold cases, bringing his hunting skills and detective experience to bear on long unsolved crimes. His accidental discovery in the mountains had reminded him that justice sometimes comes from unexpected places, and that retirement didn't mean the end of his ability to make a difference. Sarah eventually returned to teaching, but in a new school district where her story was seen as evidence of her strength, rather than a source of suspicion. Her students, many of whom learned about her experience through news reports, saw her as a hero who had overcome injustice. She began incorporating lessons about the legal system and the importance of presuming innocence into her curriculum. The friendship that developed between Sarah and Jake became a source of strength for both of them. They would meet monthly for coffee, sharing stories about their respective journeys through the criminal justice system from opposite sides. Jake's professional experience helped Sarah understand why the system had failed her, while Sarah's perspective helped Jake appreciate the human cost of those failures. 2 years after her exoneration, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at her new school. Mrs. Henderson, the store clerk whose misidentification had started the nightmare, came to apologize in person once more. The elderly woman had been struggling with guilt and wanted to make amends. Sarah, showing the grace that had helped her survive her ordeal, forgave Mrs. Henderson completely and invited her to stay for her class presentation about the importance of eyewitness accuracy. As Sarah watched Mrs. Henderson interact with her students, explaining how honest mistakes could have serious consequences, she realized how completely her perspective on justice had evolved. The experience that had once threatened to destroy her had instead taught her about resilience, forgiveness, and the complex nature of truth. She had been branded for a crime she didn't commit, but in the end, she had been marked more profoundly by her refusal to let injustice have the final word. The case became a teaching example in law schools and police academies across the country, illustrating the dangers of relying solely on eyewitness identification and the importance of thorough investigation. Sarah would occasionally speak at these institutions, sharing her story not with bitterness but with hope that future Sarah Mitchells might be spared similar ordeals. Jake Morrison's accidental discovery while hunting had set in motion a chain of events that revealed the fragility of justice and the power of persistence. For Sarah Mitchell, the journey from accused criminal to advocate for the wrongly accused had shown her that sometimes the worst things that happen to us can become the foundation for the most meaningful work of our lives. The mountains where Jake had found the truth became a symbol of hope for Sarah, proof that justice might be hidden but never truly lost, waiting to be discovered by those willing to keep searching for it.